Good afternoon, everybody. I am here in Boston with Terry also, and this is part of a two-part series. We had the first part, which is recorded, and we will send the link out with that. In the first part, we talked about the why of the capital improvements. In today's world, we are trying to build member loyalty through satisfaction and through the motivation of why people join the clubs. We took a deep dive into the process and answered the what of the capital improvement plan. And today we're going to look at the how and look at the strategies, including some of the levers that you can pull as far as your inputs and your outputs as you go ahead and model this out for the benefit of your club. Joining us today will be Eric Gregory. Eric's expert in our strategies modeling for our company, and he's our executive director on the West Coast. So, Eric, take her away.
Jim and Terry, thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning to you, depending on where you are. As Jim mentioned, I am joining you today from our Los Angeles office. This is our West Coast office at Club Benchmarking, and very much appreciate you taking some time out of your day to spend with us. We spend a lot of time here at Club Benchmarking thinking about capital planning. And Jim, I thought, did a really great job in his first part in the series, talking about the whys and the whats of capital improvement projects. And today we're really going to focus on the strategies that we can use in order to make sure that the funding mechanism makes sense for the projects that we wish to complete. So with that, I'm going to get into the presentation. We should be lasting about 45 minutes today. We'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, and we'll be happy to answer some questions for you. So a little bit of background. I actually come from the club management side. I did about 20 years as in club management, about 10 of those as a general manager. And it was during that time that I really got lots of exposure to trying to figure out how to pay for capital projects and how all of the mechanisms would work together, whether it was through debt and assessments, through initiation fees, membership growth, capital dues, and spent a lot of time during that time in my tenure thinking about these things. And it's certainly something that we put a lot of time and effort into now at Club Benchmarking. So today we're going to cover 4 basic sections. The first thing that we're going to be doing is looking at what we call a capital scorecard for your club. We're going to be looking at 3 metrics that you can look at just by analyzing your balance sheet to be able to determine how healthy your club is on the capital planning scale. We're then going to be talking about how to fund the long-range plan as opposed to funding simply the next project. We're going to be looking at the 4 capital levers that your club can pull in order to generate additional capital. And then we're going to be looking at, lastly, aligning capital revenues and expenses over time through using capital modeling. So first, before we get into the scorecard, you may have seen a slide similar to this before, but the reason why we spend so much time focusing on this at Club Benchmarking is when we analyze the financial driver for a club, in other words, how the club grows and moves forward, how does it increase its net worth, we really look at separating out the capital and operating ledgers. So as you can see on the screen here, the blue line is the operating ledger. And if you look at the median club, or the goalpost, if you will, between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, for the most part, clubs are going to be breaking even in operations. In other words, they're setting their dues lines to be able to basically have zero net effect to the club's bottom line, because they're consuming those goods and services throughout the year as a way of providing the amenities to their members. So we know that the operating ledger is quite important for your club, and we analyze it consistently. There are a few clubs, as you can see on the right circle, that do fund depreciation through their operating ledger, but it is more of a rarity in our industry. So for example, if your club was at the median and you were making 1% and you're a $7 million operating budget, if you were to say, what decisions can we make to really do well in operations and get us towards that 75th percentile? Well, if you're currently making 1% and you wanted to get to 4%, that could be the difference of about $200,000. what I would suggest to you is that that's a difficult thing to do in the private club environment, largely because the operating decisions that we have to make in order to make that kind of net return can be widely unpopular with your membership, whether it means raising prices for the goods and services, whether it means more outside events. Largely, these decisions are going to meet with a lot of resistance from your members, and there might be exceptions. But for the most part, making more money in operations may cause a little bit some dissatisfaction with your membership. If we look at the capital side on the gold line, we can see that the median club brings in about 12% capital income as opposed to when you relate it to the total operating budget for the club. So on the flip side, if we said, what decisions can we make on the capital side that could get us from the median to that 75th percentile, that difference would be about $500,000. And I would suggest to you that if a well thought out capital plan may be easier to introduce to your members than trying to make a major difference in your club's operations. Once again, there could be a few exceptions, but what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some strategies that your club can employ to do just that. So let's take a look at the capital scorecard. Once again, we're going to look at 3 metrics that you can actually look at utilizing your club's balance sheet that can give you a scorecard that you can actually determine the overall health of your capital planning. So the first metric we're going to look at is net available capital. And for those of you that have been on club benchmarking webinars before, you may have seen this metric. This is our financial insight model. And essentially what we're doing is we're taking the total capital income from the club. We're going to be adjusting for the net operating result, and we're subtracting our operating lease expenses for an amount that allows us to do one of 3 things. We can either pay down debt, we can replace capital equipment, or we can set aside funds for reserves for making sure that we're growing our club in the future. So this is a very important number to know if you're a club manager, if you're on the board, is what is our net available capital? So once again, we can reduce debt, we can replace our existing capital assets, or we can make improvement projects or fund reserves with this number. So obviously this is a major growth contributor for the club. And if we look at the industry, this line represents what the median club will do in terms of the net available capital. So we have 4 quartiles here. So if you're looking right to left, the club that is going to be on the far right quartile, 75th percentile and above, is what we call capital rich. These are typically clubs that are not only funding the replacement of its existing assets, but are likely putting aside money for future improvement projects. If we look at the quartile just to the left of that, between the 50th and 75th percentile, we're seeing clubs that likely are funding the replacement of existing assets, but probably not putting aside money for the future improvement projects. The 25th to 50th percentile are likely clubs that are not quite funding the replacement of existing assets. And the 0 to 25th percentile are what we call the capital starved clubs, which means that they are not planning anywhere close to what the club is going to be needing. And that those clubs, we would suggest, if they don't make changes, one of 2 things are going to happen. You're either going to be having an assessment-based funding strategy, or you're going to have major financial difficulties moving forward. The second metric we're going to be looking at is the club's net worth over time. And using the first metric of net available capital, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that number relative to your depreciation line. So once again, we can see our industry metrics here with the median depreciation being 11% of the amount equivalent to the club's total operating budget. And if you look at the net available capital line, the question is are you at least covering your depreciation with that line? And if you are, the question is by how much? And so what we would suggest to you is that the net worth of the club is directly tied to these 2 metrics. So once again, the net available capital, if it is growing at a rate greater than depreciation, it is going to have a positive net worth of the club over time. And the converse is also true. So we can see that the financial insight model is now taking into account the depreciation line, looking at the change in total net worth of the club. Now, we would suggest to you that the net worth of the club should be growing at a rate that's greater than just zero. And there's a few different reasons for that. Number one is we have to account for inflation. So we know that assets are going to be more expensive to replace in the future than they were when we purchased them. We can look at the construction labor and materials at an average of 2.2% per year. We also may have some fully depreciated assets in use. We also know that when we actually do a capital reserve study, and we've done this for nearly 200 clubs now, the fixed asset schedule can be off by that number up to 35%, meaning when you do the physical inspection of the property, plant, and equipment, that can vary greatly from the fixed asset schedule that you may have on the books. We also know that we're not taking into account aspirational capital for the club. In other words, are we considering what future improvement projects the club is going to be looking at moving forward? So our recommendation is that your club's net worth should be growing at least 3.5%, basically to cover your depreciation expense, not including the aspirational capital needs. So when we look at a chart of the industry on the net worth over time, we can see that at the median, clubs are growing their net worth by approximately 2%. So in other words, the median club is not keeping up with inflation. We can see that there are about 25% of clubs that actually have a negative net worth, and about 5% of clubs that are actually growing at the rate that we suggest. This is actually a metric that we can provide for you at your club, and at the end of the presentation, we'd be happy to give you that information. The third metric we're going to be looking at for the capital scorecard is the net to gross property, plant, and equipment. Net to gross PP&E is essentially a test of physical asset depletion. So you may have seen this slide before as well, but if you look at the club on the left, if that club was built 30 years ago and it's been fully depreciated, we can see that the net PP&E would be zero. The accumulated depreciation would be exactly what you paid for it. So the net to gross ratio would be zero. If you look at the club on the right, if it costs $30 million and it just opened yesterday, we'll have depreciated nothing. Our net PP&E would be 30 million, so the net to gross would be 100%. So essentially, the higher the net to gross percentage, the more fresh the assets, and the lower the percentage, the more worn and depleted the assets. So this is a simple test that your club can do in order to determine a simple test of your physical plant depletion. And once again, the higher the ratio would be fresher and more up to date, and the lower ratio would be older and more worn. The median for our club is 48%. If you want to take a look as an example in the hospitality industry, we can look at the Marriott Corporation at 70%. So if you walk into a Marriott property, you can get an idea of how does it look, how does it feel, how fresh do the assets seem to appear to you. That club would, or that property would be at 70% net to gross PP&E. The highest club that I have personally seen is 72%, and the lowest club I've personally seen is 7%. So obviously there's a huge range in difference between where your club falls on that spectrum. Now, once again, this is a simple test. If you want to get a very precise test of your physical plant, we do recommend that your club have a capital reserve study in place. Okay, let's talk now about long-range plan for capital funding. When we talk about the long-range plan, we want to think about the club's role and their fiduciary responsibilities. And when we think about fiduciary duty, one of the things that we think about is that we really need to be knowing what we have, how do we protect it, and how do we grow the assets of our club. So we need to be thinking about the timely replacement of our current assets, which we call required capital, but we also need to be thinking about future improvement projects that are designed to grow our amenities, which is what we call aspirational capital. And long-range planning needs to factor in both of these capital investments for your club. A few numbers relating to this. The typical 18-hole private club is going to have anywhere between 300 and 600 individual assets that are going to require replacement. In doing our reserve studies, we've identified a number of between $8 million and $11 million for that same typical 18-hole club that a club should expect to spend over the next 10 years to replace current assets prior to their useful life's expiration. And when we talk about aspirational capital projects, we look at clubs that engage in these improvement projects every 2 to 5 years. Just as a couple of examples of this, and we don't have very specific data across the industry, although we're working on gathering it, but the last 2 times that we gave a presentation at a chapter, we recently did the Arizona chapter, and they were doing improvement projects every 2.5 years, and the average amount of those projects was $2.5 million. The Golden State chapter was doing improvement projects every 2.2 years, and their average improvement was around $3 million. So obviously, those are some very significant projects. The question that you would want to ask yourself is, look back over the last 10 years, how many improvement projects has our club undergone, and what was the average amount of that? And are we actually planning for the next set of improvement projects looking forward in the next 10 years? Let's take a look at the median 18-hole private club, and we're going to call this Club XYZ. This is essentially the median club in the database of 1,000 clubs that we have at Club Benchmarking. The average annual operating revenue is $6.3 million, 403 full member equivalents. Some people call that full dues equivalents. The net initiation fee, in other words, the total initiation fee minus any selling member's equity, is around $25,000. And the capital dues at the median club, or Club XYZ, is around $50 per month. And our attrition rate is 5%. Why are we looking at this? Because we're talking about what the median club is generating in terms of capital and what the median club should be expecting to spend. So if we take the numbers, if we talked about that $11 million over that 10-year period, which is what the club should expect to spend if they're going to be replacing those items prior to their useful life expiration, that number would be $950,000. We have an aspirational capital fund allowance of $240,000. And how we came up with that number is a very conservative $1.2 million project every 5 years. And we certainly saw that the 2 examples I gave you were much larger than that, but we're being conservative with this number. The average club has an annual debt reduction of about $260,000. So if you look at the total annual capital requirement of what a club should expect to spend, it's nearly $1.5 million. And for Club XYZ, we're also going to look at the capital that they will be generating on their current trajectory. Operating result should be near break even. The net initiation fee income for Club XYZ would be $425,000, and a capital dues / assessment line would be $480,000. So Club XYZ's annual capital revenue would be coming in at $905,000. The difference there being $545,000 from what a club should expect to spend from what they're actually generating. And we're going to talk about why that is. We would like to say that the reason why there is a gap between projected needs and capital resources is because many clubs, I would suggest to say most clubs, employ what we call a reactive capital strategy. So most clubs are focusing largely on the income statement rather than looking at the balance sheet and capital, which is really the financial driver of the club. The club may not have a professional capital reserve study to identify and prioritize and plan ahead for the timely replacement of those existing capital assets. And the club may not be planning for the funding of future aspirational improvement projects. So once again, we would call that a reactive capital strategy, and the natural outcome would be assessments and debt by employing that strategy. This is an example of modeling out what that 10 years of capital revenue and expense would look like. And as we can see, the club would be short over that 10-year period of about $5 million, which is the amount that it would need to make up in assessment or debt income unless it chooses to employ additional funding strategies. We've gotten a question recently at Club Benchmarking about how do I know what percent fully funded my club needs to be? And this is a very interesting question and one we're going to be spending some more time on. But if you look at the HOA model, they'll essentially say, what is it that we believe we need to spend over time? So we know that we're going to be taking a capital asset, and if that capital asset's going to cost me $10,000, I know I'm going to need to replace it for $16,000. I'm going to divide that by the number of years of useful life, and I should be taking in that much capital income to cover that year over year. So in other words, are your members paying what you consume, or are they simply waiting until you get to a point where it's too late and you have no option left except to assess your members? So if your club has a cash balance available for improvement projects or replacements of $300,000, and you know that you have 10 years worth of repair and replace numbers at $9.5 million, you could say that we're 3% funded. If you want to look out over a 10-year period, and we do this when we model clubs, you could say that we know that we're taking in this much capital income, we know this is our repair and replace number, and you could say we're 69% funded. If you actually want to factor in your improvement projects, then you can say that we're 55% funded over these 10 years. The key is for clubs that you really should be looking out over a significant period, factoring in how much are we collecting in transfer fees, capital dues, assessments, what's our debt service line, and putting all of these things into an equation that makes sense for your club. Once again, we can see this graphed out over a 10-year period, and this is typically not a trend the club wants to be in. So once again, reactive capital strategies are largely going to be driven by opinion versus data. And we see this quite often at club benchmarking, where a capital reserve study will come into the club, and all of a sudden you get a board member that says, well, that's way too much to spend on repair and replace. And the question is too much according to who, or too much according to what? So once again, data-driven leadership is something that we practice and preach here at club benchmarking. With our reactive capital strategy, we largely see clubs have deferred maintenance, and the common funding methods for these types of clubs are assessments and debt. And reactive strategies typically fund one project at a time. So we get a lot of clubs that come to us and say, you know, we want to do this $8 million improvement project. How are we going to fund it? And the first thing that we do is we don't ask them what's the next project. We ask them, what's the long range plan? How much are you spending in repair and replace? What are the next set of improvements moving forward? What's your current level of debt service? And there's much more that goes into it than just how do we fund the one project. When we're in reactive mode, this is our common funding method. So if we look at member assessments, there are a lot of pitfalls that we need to be aware of when levying a member assessment. So when our members are paying their bill every month, most of the time they're on what we call autopilot. The bill comes in, the member is very happy with their value at the club. They typically don't give it much thought, and they pay the bill. Sometimes they don't even look at the bill. But if we're going to give them something that is now controversial, such as a large assessment, especially if that assessment's for something that you should have been collecting for all along, now the member has a chance to reevaluate its member proposition. They might say, how many rounds of golf have I played in the last 6 months? What's my average cost for a round of golf? And that's typically not a position that a club wants to be in terms of financial value for the members. Using debt, of course, we can use debt at clubs. About 75% of clubs do have debt. But with debt, we need to make sure that the future capital replacements and the aspirational improvements are also funded, and those do not get left out. And consider the difference in using debt for repair and replace versus using debt for an aspirational capital improvement. In other words, should we have been collecting for this all along versus is this now a new improvement project that we've recently come up with? As I mentioned, approximately 3/4 of clubs throughout the country have debt. The median is $1.8 million. And loans can certainly be used as an upfront funding of large projects. Most clubs will have assessments that will be collected over time in order to pay for them. But we need to make sure that the repayment terms account for the future repair and replace and the improvement projects. Your bylaws are likely going to be something that will require membership approval. And along with debt comes costly campaigns in many cases that are required to gain those votes. And once again, if we do have extended terms, balloon payments, those can be binding future boards to limit access to future capital. And any time that your club has talk of debt covenants, a negative pledge, or encumbering the property, immediately the rumor mill is going to start to occur. And I'm sure that many of you have experienced that in your careers. I know I certainly have. Let's talk now about a proactive approach to capital planning. So when we're having a proactive strategy, we're going to start with the mission of the club and let that drive the strategy moving forward. We're going to work on zero-based capital budgeting. We're going to have a capital funding philosophy. We're going to have a capital reserve study. We're going to plan for our future improvements. And we're going to be communicating that plan to our membership. This is a quote that I like to use from one of the largest, CFO of one of the largest nonprofits in the country, which basically says that if we're in a financial capacity in a nonprofit, we have to budget for the mission, not change the mission to suit the budget. And I see this quite often at clubs, where clubs feel as though they're absolutely limited by what they can charge, and they'll basically take the mission of the club and say, where can we compromise, where can we not spend? A zero-based capital budget is something that I believe a lot of clubs need to begin thinking about. And if we think about our operating budget, what is the most important decision that comes from that process? And I would suggest to you that when we're doing our operating budget, the most important decision is, where do we set the dues line? And of course, we're going to analyze the expenses and look at the non-dues revenues. But at the end of the day, what's going to make up that gap is the dues line. And I believe that we have to do the same thing with our capital budgets. Operating budgets are going to address 1 year at a time, but our capital budgets have to extend well out into the future for a variety of reasons. Number one is that our replacement expenses are variable and they're going to change year to year. We need to incorporate the next 2 to 4 improvement projects. Our capital investments and income have to align over that time, and commonly we're going to use debt and or assessment strategies that can extend out up to a 10-year period. So we have to see, how does that all come to fruition, and make sure that the investments and income align over that time frame. When we talk about a funding policy, whether we know it or not, most clubs already have an operating funding policy. And typically what that means is that, when we do our budget, we know our operating expenses, we know the cost of providing the level of services the members expect, we know the non-dues revenues. All of those are projected. What has to make up the difference is the operating dues. And of course, we're going to exclude the depreciation expense in there. What is very uncommon is that we do the same thing on the capital side. Do we know all of the expenses that are going to be required on the capital side, and are we setting the dues and fees to make sure that those are funded over time? So in other words, our members, for the large part, are funding operations. However, we often feel short to funding capital. Here's an example of a capital funding policy that we can look at for a club. And this is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all. But if a club is going to actually have a funding policy, they need to know where the money's coming from and where the money is going. Are we using a reserve study to determine our repair and replace expenditures? Are we segregating the capital and operating ledgers? Where are we setting the capital dues, and what exactly do they cover? Who prioritizes the improvement projects? And what's the role of transfer fees? So all of these things can be set to actually coming up with a capital funding policy example. And I would suggest to you that a best practice, if you can get there, is to be able to have your capital dues line fund the repair and replace of existing assets. And the reason for that is because the capital dues line is very low risk revenue. You're not requiring new member transactions to happen for that revenue to come in. We would actually call it income because we're not actually selling anything to get it. But we can also correlate the initiation fee income to new improvement projects. So as you can see the line below, it's a great message to send to your members is, hey members, you did a great job bringing in all these new members. Now we're going to go ahead and start this improvement project that you've been asking for. Taking a look at a capital reserve study, once again, this is a best practice that we like clubs to have. A professional study to identify and assess the useful life of your physical assets. We at Club Benchmarking, when we do them, we look at a 20-year period. But repair and replace example, chairs, irrigation systems, roof, HVAC systems, even bunker sand and liners. This is an example of what a capital reserve study output looks like. And of course, our aspirational improvement projects. So examples, a new casual bar and lounge, construction of a new fitness center. These are things that enhance the membership experience and keep the club relevant to both your existing and your future members. And with capital planning, we have to plan for both of these. This is what it looks like in our modeling platform. So once again, we identify the repair and replace expense for the club. We also look at the strategic improvements to give us a total capital investment over a 10-year period. Now let's talk for a few minutes about the 4 capital levers. So these are the things that your club can pull from in order to generate additional capital without having to resort to assessments, debt, or sale of land. And the 4 capital levers we'll look at are operating profits or losses, net transfer fees, capital dues, and membership growth. The club has the ability to make changes to any of these 4 levers, and a strategy should be developed for each one of them. This is how the industry currently funds capital. As you can see, net initiation fees are a little over a third. It looks like our capital dues line down on the bottom got cut off, but the orange pie slice is our capital dues. And we also have other capital income in there, such as we have membership assessments. We've got a smaller line for sale of land and things of that nature, and of course, operating surpluses. I apologize if that got cut off just a little bit. So capital lever number 1, net from operations. As we all know, that operational shortfall is going to drain the capital account unless you do an operating assessment or true up, or what we call a 13th month of dues. Any operating surplus is going to add to available capital, but as we talked about, in most cases, operating net is not going to be the financial driver. When we've worked with clubs in the past, primarily the clubs that we look at operations for are those that are sustaining a heavy loss. And in many cases, we've identified the operating expenses to a point where we feel like we couldn't make any more changes, and the only way that we could shore up that operating loss is to get the operating dues to a level to actually sustain a net zero. This is the industry chart for net operating result. As you can see, most clubs are slightly better than break even, but for the most part, you're looking at anywhere between a negative 3% to a positive 4%. Our second capital lever is net initiation fees. So the net initiation fee is the total initiation fee for joining the club minus any selling member's equity or other refundable amount going to the selling member. So in other words, it's the amount that contributes to a club's capital fund. Some clubs will call this their transfer fee. And the net initiation fee is going to reflect the history, the membership, and the service levels and quality of your club. However, these fees can also be inconsistent, and in most cases, they're insufficient to fund the entirety of the capital needs of the club. So many clubs need to consider installment payments. Are we going to allow our members to pay their initiation fee over a 3 to 4 year period? Non-refundable equity is happening more and more now for clubs. In other words, is our selling member getting a refundable amount when they sell their certificate? And do initiation fees represent the value of your club's assets? And I'd like to dive into that question a little bit more with a couple of slides. So when we look at our database, one of the things that we look at is the initiation fee relative to the unrestricted net assets of your club. In other words, does the initiation fee represent the value of your club's assets? So if you look at that number on your balance sheet, the unrestricted net assets, divide that by the full member equivalents, you'll come up with a number. In the database, we will see that that number is an equivalent of 144%. So in other words, if the unrestricted net assets per full member equivalent at your club is $20,000, you could get a relative idea that, in the average in the industry, that club's initiation fee would be somewhere around $27,000. Now, does that mean that your club has to go out and immediately change that? Absolutely not. But I think that it is a metric that you want your board to be aware of, does our initiation fee represent the value of our club's assets? Another way you can look at net initiation fees is as a percentage of operating revenue. And we can see the median in the industry is an amount equivalent to 5% of your club's operating revenue. One last way that we can look at initiation fee is as a percentage of dues for my full family membership. So in other words, am I charging a large amount for dues, for operating dues, yet am I charging, less than 100% of that for my initiation fee? So we can see that the median in the industry is 345%. Once again, this is not a suggestion that your club should absolutely go and make that change, but these are metrics that you should be aware of to say, does the initiation fee represent the value of our club's assets? Our third capital lever is capital dues. And capital dues are a stable and a consistent funding depreciation. All current and future members are going to pay them, and now about 2/3 of clubs do have a capital dues line. Questions would be, what do our capital dues cover? Are they meant to cover our long-term repair and replace of existing assets? When was the last time our capital dues was increased? So in other words, did I put in a capital dues line 5 years ago because the club down the street just put one in? And when was the last time I've actually changed that or raised it? Clubs will often raise their operating dues between 3 and 5% on an annual basis, and should we not be doing the same thing for our capital dues line? Food and beverage minimums are often something that we look at when we work with clubs, because when we look at the financial driver of the club, the food and beverage minimum has very, very low impact on that. However, putting in a stable means of capital funding does have a very large impact at clubs. And sometimes we can get clubs to reconsider the food and beverage minimum and say, can we take an amount of 50% of that and put it on the capital dues line? And should we be relying on our transfer fees to contribute to funding depreciation? Full member capital dues in the industry is right about $50 per month or $600 per year. Keep in mind that there are 1/3 of the clubs that actually do not have a capital dues line. So if you look at the clubs that do have capital dues, it's going to be closer to $1,000 annually. And our last lever that we're going to look at is membership growth. And we call membership growth the great multiplier because it does contribute to the net initiation fee and the capital dues lines. We work with many clubs that do wind up reevaluating their bylaws and membership caps once they understand how much money each member is going to need to contribute to actually fully fund the capital needs. And because we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward a little bit more. But let's take a look at a 3% net growth versus a flat growth for Club XYZ. So the same numbers for the median club. And if that club had 3% net growth versus flat on an annual basis, in 1 year, it would be a net of $150,000, and at 10 years, it would be close to $2 million. So membership growth obviously can have a very large impact on the club's capital funding. And our last section of the webinar today, we're going to be talking about aligning expenses and revenues over time. And what we're going to use is something called capital strategies modeling. This is a way that we do it at Club Benchmarking. I have seen some other clubs that have their own modeling systems. We'd like to think that we've put a lot of time and effort into developing one for the industry, but we'll show you a little bit what it looks like on how you use modeling to align those expenses over time. So once again, we showed you this slide before, looking at the club's total capital investment needed, repair and replace, and strategic improvements. Also looking at things like beginning balances, existing debt service, installment payments due, and minimum established cash balances or restricted funds all need to be factored in. We're then going to look at projecting out our capital income. So our sources of capital are going to be our surpluses or deficits, Basically, the four levers that we just discussed. We're also going to look at membership assessments, any loans or sale of land that the club either has done or is considering doing. So essentially, we're going to project out our total capital income for the same 10-year period, and we're going to develop what we call the gap. So this is our percent that is unfunded, and at our current trajectory, this is also our reactive portion of capital planning. So we know that if we need 13.7 over that 10-year period, and we're collecting 8.3, we know that we have a shortfall of over $5 million. And if we don't want to go into an assessment-based strategy, we're going to need to make some changes. When we go about making changes to our levers, one of the things that we like to do is look at some industry benchmarks and say, what would happen if we were able to get to specific benchmarks for the industry, whether it's from initiation fees, capital dues, or membership growth. And we certainly can look at what the club that's established best practices is doing and what would happen to our club if we were able to get there. We can then use what we call sensitivity analysis with our capital dues and or initiation fees. So this is sort of a look into the model where we can actually take the capital dues, we can take the initiation fees, and we can start to strategize or put in sensitivity analysis that would say, what would happen if we put a $50 capital dues line in? Or what if we did $10 a year over the next 10 years? And as you can see, this is one example of how we might strategize with capital dues. So for Club XYZ, if we wanted that club to be fully funded, how much would we need to put in as a capital dues strategy? And we can see that if the club put in a $100 increase in year one, it would have to do $20 annually thereafter. And these are amounts monthly. So the club would have to make some pretty significant capital dues changes if it were simply using capital dues as a strategy. This is what it would look like when we chart it out. We can also look at membership strategy options. So when we're doing our sensitivity analysis, depending on the club, we might ask what might happen if we were able to get to 3% net growth, or what might happen if we were to go ahead and do that, that new gym project that the club is considering, and what effect is that going to have on, the amount of junior members or the amount of social members, and we can begin to strategize on those things as well. And we can look at the same type of a strategy when we use our modeling, and we can say, what would it take for Club XYZ to be fully funded if it simply were just to look at membership growth as a strategy? And we would see that Club XYZ would have to have net membership increase of 11% per year, which is very significant. Once again, we can see that graphed out as options. Using debt and assessment strategies, we would recommend that we always want to look at the possibility of using assessments and debt, but we do want to approach these with cautions. Once again, these are alternatives to using the capital levers. Your club may simply be too far behind to avoid using any of these strategies. But if we are going to factor them in, we do have to factor in potential membership attrition if we are going to levy a large assessment. How many members may leave if we do that? We have to forecast the debt over the service life, and we need to make sure that the future improvements and replacements are not compromised. Are we going to have a political firestorm? And how many times can you go to the well with your members? In other words, did you levy an assessment to your members 3 years ago telling them, well, we're taking care of sins of the past, we're going to go ahead and do an assessment, but then everything will be fine? Are you now coming back 3 to 4 years later and saying, well, guess what, we have another one coming? So we can take a look at our sensitivity analysis. Once again, loan options, assessment options, different interest rates, service life years. We can also look at accelerated loan payouts. Same thing with our assessment. And in looking at a strategy that sort of combines all of these things, we said, well, the capital dues was a really aggressive strategy. We're not sure if our members want to pay that. We thought the membership growth at 11% was unrealistic. But what would happen if we sort of had this combined strategy and said, we think we can get to 3% on membership growth. We think that our members would be okay with a $25 increase to the capital dues line, and we can do that each year. And in order to handle that short-term cash need, we can take out a $3 million loan. And putting it all together, we think we can be fully funded. And this is what it would look like on the graph as well. And once again, every club does strategy different. You know, looking at the 4 capital levers, using the potential for debt and or assessments, doing them cautiously, and at the end of the day, which is the right way to do it for your club. But the key is that you want to make sure that you're thinking about the next 10 years is what we would recommend, the next 3 to 4 improvement projects, and making sure that you've got a really solid handle on the repair and replace needs at your club. So let's summarize. Our capital scorecard, which you can use the following benchmarks to generate for your club. We're going to look at net available capital, your club's net worth over time, and the net to gross PP&E. Funding the club's long-range plan, we need to make sure that we're doing a timely replacement of the current assets, looking at the next 3 to 4 aspirational improvement projects, and any current and projected debt service. Our 4 capital levers that you can pull from are adjustments to operating gains or losses, net initiation fees, capital dues, and membership growth. And our median 18-hole golf club, or Club XYZ, is currently underfunding capital requirements by more than $500,000. We know that the reactive approach, the common outcomes are assessments and debt without adequate planning for aspirational projects. And a proactive approach uses a third-party capital reserve study. A capital funding philosophy is adopted by the club. We set our dues and fees accordingly. And we use capital modeling to incorporate both the reserve study data, aspirational projects, projected capital income, identifying the gap, and we use sensitivity analysis with the levers to identify the solutions. So I know that we had a lot of information here today, and I appreciate your patience in getting through the bulk of these slides. I'd like to thank you for spending the last 50 minutes with us or so. These are our CMA chapter code words. If you happen to be a member of one of these chapters, please email your managing director and use the code words that you see here. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and send it back to you, Terry, to see if we have any questions.
Okay, Eric, this is Jim, so I'm going to jump in because we've got some questions for you. So first question is, do you consider serious damages to the golf course due to long, cold winter to be charged to capital improvement reserves or the emergency fund, or is that a regular annual expense? What's your experience with how clubs treat emergency reserves and how do they fund them?
Well, I think it really depends on how often that's happening at your club and how foreseeable is it. If it's something that really is not foreseeable, if it was let's say it was a tornado that came through or a hurricane, that would be something that I think emergency reserves would be used for and or your club's insurance plan. So I would first consult with your insurance plan and see what it covers. But if you are in a cold weather climate and you can expect damage from frost, 5 out of the last 10 years, I would suggest to you that you should be putting it in your capital plan. So it really does depend on how foreseeable it is versus how much of a surprise it would be.
Okay. And Eric, how about how clubs that generate capital dues, and I think you said it was 66%, how do they generally divide that up between repair and maintenance and future assessments for new things?
Well, Jim, I think one of the points that we mentioned earlier is that there typically isn't a capital funding philosophy that is clearly identified at the club. And so what winds up happening is the club collects capital dues, but there's not a specific allocation of capital dues to what it funds. And usually it's essentially mingled in with the net initiation fee. And from there, the club basically spends what it can afford. And so I think that if the club is going to look at this as a forward-thinking and proactive strategy, you really want to identify, if we have a capital dues line, what is its role, what does it cover, and what can I communicate to my members to say, this is why our capital dues line is in place. And once again, if you can get there, if you can cover the repair and replace needs of your club with a capital dues line, that's a very healthy place to be.
Great. There's a question, has anybody ever heard of grant money for irrigation replacement? So if anybody has heard of that, please use the chat that's available there and just type that in so everybody could see that. And then Eric, how do you define transfer fee? What's the definition of transfer fee?
Well, there's a lot of people that will use these terms and commingle them. I would say that the net initiation fee and the transfer fee are really the same. So in other words, it's the amount that the club is going to generate for its capital account. So let's say, for example, you're an incoming member, writes a check to the club for $50,000, and $25,000 is the equity portion going to the selling member. Then that $25,000 difference would be the net initiation fee, or otherwise the transfer fee.
Great. And then Eric, can you touch on the alternate CapEx funding ideas such as paying the dues ahead or private member donations or any corporate funding or grant opportunities? Are you familiar with clubs that do that?
Yeah, I've certainly encountered clubs that have a variety of sources that come from, whether it's member funds, that we also see some things like what we call Santa Claus funds. I work with some clubs that tell me, all I have to do is tell my finance chairman, we want to do this, and he'll just cut me a check. There's a variety of things that happen out there that go outside of the capital levers that we discussed today. And all of those things just need to be factored in when you make the capital plan for your club. Whether you can count on them or not really depends on how that's set up, but they do need to be factored in at some level.
Okay, great. And how about, there's a question about operating reserves as well. What's your recommendation on the operating budget about how much days of reserve is recommended? The question asked about is 90 days a good operating reserve?
It really depends on the size of your operation and what it is that you're trying to fund. With an operating reserve, typically in my experience, we would call it an operating float. So this would be the amount that we would need to make sure that AP and AR are never at a point where they go negative. So if you know that your payroll expense is happening, on the 5th and the 20th, or you have to pay your insurance premiums on a certain date, you need to make sure that you have an operating float in that account that can cover that. We know at clubs, we typically get a payment for the services that we offer well before. So in other words, we're spending the expense during the time that we're providing the service, and we're collecting the check 30 days later if we're lucky. So we do have to have an operating float that covers that. Many clubs will have a capital minimum that they like to keep in the account for their rainy day fund. In other words, if we were to have the worst case scenario happen to us, would we be able to, make payroll for 3 months or take care of our staff? That really has to be a decision by your board, but it does need to be a question that needs to be asked. Okay,
great. And is it your experience, and not from an accounting standpoint, but from a practical standpoint, do clubs put interest expense or debt into operating or into the capital expense? How do you treat that in the modeling?
In the modeling, we would include it in capital. Simply put, it's because we're looking at the total cost of debt service, not merely the principal. So in other words, if I'm going to go to my members and say, we're taking out this debt, I need to put in a capital dues line of $50, it needs to cover the principal and the interest and not just the principal. Now, how you do it, from an accounting standpoint might be different, but from a capital planning standpoint, you need to factor in both.
Yeah, and I think many clubs or most clubs put the interest expense into the operations because it's an expense item that you can use. So, okay, I'll turn it back over to Terry to do the housekeeping to go out of that. So, Terry.
Thank you all for joining us today. We've recorded this session, and I will be distributing a link once I have that processed and posted. Might be Monday, and you'll get that link by email. We don't distribute the slide deck, but you will have the link to that video, and also Eric's contact information is on the screen right now. So if you want to talk to him and have your questions answered directly, he's available. Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.